They had no idea that the woman they drugged, left for dead, and stole billions from would rise from amnesia to destroy them all. When her own sister and cousin staged her death to steal her tech empire, genius CEO Anya Reid survived with no memory and ended up working in her own company without knowing it. Watch as her buried brilliance surfaces, terrifying the family who thought they'd erased her forever. See her sister's cruel taunt trigger a devastating memory flood that transforms broken victim into vengeful mastermind. You're about to witness the most brutal family betrayal meet the most calculated corporate revenge in history, where stolen identity meets recovered genius, and where one woman's resurrection becomes an entire industry's reckoning. Stay until the Phoenix Protocol activates and the dead CEO delivers justice that will leave you speechless.
They had no idea that the woman they were about to betray, drug, and steal everything from would one day return from the dead to destroy their lives in the most devastating way possible. Anya Reid stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor, her silhouette framed against the Seattle skyline as she surveyed the empire she had built from nothing. At 34, she was the youngest black woman to ever create a multi-billion-dollar technology company, and Oratech had become more than just a business. It was proof that vision, determination, and brilliant strategy could overcome every obstacle that society placed in the path of someone who looked like her. The boardroom behind her buzzed with the controlled energy of executives preparing for the most important presentation of the quarter. 12 of the industry's most powerful investors sat around the polished mahogany table, their combined wealth capable of funding entire countries, yet every eye in the room was focused on Anya with the kind of respectful attention reserved for someone whose intelligence had consistently generated extraordinary returns on their investments. "Ladies and gentlemen," Anya began, turning from the window with the fluid confidence that had made her a legend in Silicon Valley, "what I'm about to show you will redefine how the world thinks about artificial intelligence integration." Her voice carried the kind of natural authority that made seasoned CEOs take notes, and as she activated the presentation system with a gesture that seemed almost magical in its precision, the room fell into the reverent silence that accompanied genuine innovation. But what the investors couldn't see, what Anya's brilliant mind hadn't detected, despite her usually flawless instincts for reading people and situations, was the carefully orchestrated betrayal being planned by the two people who should have been her most trusted allies. In the corner of the boardroom, her cousin Marcus sat with the attentive expression of a loyal family member, his expensive suit and confident posture masking the envy that had been growing like cancer in his heart for 5 years. Marcus had watched Anya's meteoric rise with a mixture of admiration and resentment that had slowly curdled into something far more dangerous. He had joined Oratech as chief operating officer not out of family loyalty, but because proximity to power was the first step in stealing it. Every board meeting, every strategic decision, every moment of Anya's success had been both inspiration and torment for someone who believed that gender and circumstance had given her opportunities that should have been his by right of intelligence and ambition.
Beside him sat Chloe, Anya's younger sister, whose role as chief financial officer had given her access to every financial system, every legal document, and every vulnerability in the corporate structure that Anya had built. Where Marcus harbored obvious envy, Chloe's resentment was more complex and therefore more dangerous. She had spent her entire life living in the shadow of her brilliant older sister, being introduced as Anya Reid's sister, rather than being recognized for her own considerable talents in finance and strategic planning. Together, Marcus and Chloe had spent months planning what they privately called the correction, a scheme that would remove Anya from the equation and place control over empire in the hands of people they believed were better suited to manage such extraordinary wealth and influence. They had studied her routines, analyzed her security protocols, and most importantly, they had gained access to her medical records and legal documentation through their positions of trust within the company. As Anya continued her presentation, describing breakthrough algorithms that would revolutionize how artificial intelligence learned and adapted, Marcus and Chloe exchanged subtle glances that confirmed their readiness to execute a plan months in the making. They had prepared false medical documentation, secured power of attorney through forged signatures, and arranged for the kind of accident that would explain Anya's sudden disappearance from both the company and public life. The irony was devastating and complete. Anya had built Auratech not just as a business, but as a family legacy, bringing her cousin and sister into leadership roles because she believed that shared blood meant shared loyalty. She had trusted them with access to her personal information, her financial systems, and her daily routines because family was supposed to be the one relationship that transcended competition and ambition. But family, as Anya was about to discover in the most brutal way possible, could also be the source of the deepest betrayal, the most intimate violation of trust, and the kind of personal destruction that struck at the very core of identity and belonging. The presentation that should have been her greatest triumph was about to become the last memory of her life as Anya Reid, CEO and visionary, before everything she had built was stolen by the people she loved most. If you believe that family should lift you up, not tear you down, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who understands that trust is precious and betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from those closest to us. Subscribe because you're about to witness the most devastating family betrayal in corporate history, and trust me, you won't want to miss how this brilliant woman rises from the ashes to reclaim everything that was stolen from her.
1 year later, the tragedy had not stopped yet, and what emerged from the ashes of that betrayal would prove that sometimes the most devastating attacks on our identity can't destroy our essence, only bury it until the right moment brings it blazing back to the surface. The woman who had once commanded boardrooms and revolutionized entire industries now sat on the edge of a narrow bed in a cramped studio apartment in a neighborhood where survival was more important than success, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. Jane, that was the name on the documents she had been given when she woke up in the hospital with no memory of who she was or how she had gotten there, pressed her palms against her temples as another wave of splitting pain crashed through her skull. The headaches came without warning, always accompanied by fragments of images that made no sense, gleaming conference rooms, complex mathematical equations floating in the air, and faces that felt familiar but belonged to no context she could remember. The medical records, which she had read dozens of times searching for clues about her past, told a story of a woman found after a devastating car accident with severe brain trauma and no identification. The social worker had explained that without family to claim her, and with no records matching her fingerprints or dental work, she had become what the system called a Jane Doe recovery case, someone who existed in the present tense only, with no past to anchor her identity or future to guide her decisions. But Jane's mind, even damaged and fragmented as it appeared to be, retained something that her attackers had never anticipated: an intuitive understanding of systems, patterns, and organizational structures that functioned on a level so fundamental that not even amnesia could erase it. When she looked at her monthly budget, she didn't just see numbers. She saw inefficiencies, optimization opportunities, and strategic possibilities that seemed to flow from some deep well of knowledge she couldn't consciously access. That morning, Jane stood outside the glass doors of Meridian Logistics, a mid-sized tech company that handled supply chain management for various corporations.
The job posting had been for an entry-level data entry position, but something about the company's name had triggered a flutter of recognition that she couldn't explain. She smoothed down her thrift store blazer and walked into the lobby with the quiet confidence of someone who had no choice but to succeed, because failure meant homelessness and hunger. The office environment felt simultaneously foreign and familiar, like walking through a house she might have lived in during a dream. Employees moved with the purposeful energy of people working on complex problems, their conversations peppered with technical jargon that Jane found herself understanding, despite having no memory of ever learning those concepts.
"You must be the new hire," said David Chen, a middle manager whose tone immediately established that he viewed Jane as an inconvenience rather than an asset. His eyes swept over her appearance with the kind of dismissive assessment that communicated clearly that he had already decided she wasn't worth his time or attention. "I'm assuming you can handle basic computer tasks? We've had some issues with people overstating their qualifications." The microaggression was subtle but unmistakable, wrapped in professional language that provided plausible deniability while still conveying his assumption that Jane's race and modest appearance meant she was probably less capable than other candidates. "I can handle whatever you need me to handle," Jane replied calmly, her voice carrying a steady confidence that seemed to surprise David. As he led her to a cramped desk in the corner of the office, David explained her responsibilities with the patronizing tone of someone addressing a child. "You'll be inputting shipping data and tracking information. It's pretty straightforward stuff, but attention to detail is crucial. We can't afford mistakes when we're dealing with our corporate clients." What David didn't understand, what none of them could have predicted, was that Jane's damaged brain still contained the neural pathways of someone who had built a multi-billion-dollar empire through strategic thinking and systems optimization. As she began working with the shipping data, patterns immediately jumped out at her. Inefficiencies in routing that were costing the company thousands of dollars per month, redundancies in tracking protocols that could be streamlined, and optimization opportunities that could revolutionize the entire operation. When Jane quietly suggested improvements during her first week, David dismissed them as lucky guesses from someone who didn't understand the bigger picture. But her suggestions worked, consistently and dramatically, improving efficiency rates that had been stagnant for years. Each success was met not with recognition, but with increased suspicion and resentment from supervisors who couldn't reconcile her apparent low status with her undeniable competence. The woman they saw as expendable labor was actually the brilliant mind that had once revolutionized artificial intelligence integration, and her unconscious genius was beginning to surface despite every attempt to suppress and diminish it.
But what happened next would prove that true genius creates ripples that can't be contained, even when the person creating them has no memory of ever possessing such extraordinary abilities. 3 weeks into Jane's employment at Meridian Logistics, her quiet suggestions had transformed operational efficiency by 37%. A huge improvement, so dramatic that it had caught the attention of someone whose job was to notice patterns that others missed. Leo Martinez sat in his cluttered cubicle on the 3rd floor, surrounded by monitors displaying complex data analytics that most people would find incomprehensible. As a senior data analyst, Leo's role was to identify inefficiencies, predict system failures, and optimize performance across all of Meridian's operations. He had been doing this work for 8 years, and he had never seen anything like what was happening in the shipping department since Jane's arrival. The metrics were impossible to ignore. Routing errors had dropped to nearly zero. Processing times had been cut in half. Customer satisfaction scores were reaching levels that the company had never achieved in its 15-year history. But according to the official reports, these improvements were being attributed to new management protocols and updated software systems, not to suggestions from an entry-level data entry clerk with no apparent background in logistics or systems optimization. Leo's analytical mind refused to accept coincidence as an explanation.
he began tracking the correlation between Jane's suggestions and performance improvements, creating a detailed timeline that revealed a pattern so clear it was almost mathematical in its precision. Every innovation, every breakthrough, every solution that was supposedly developed by management could be traced back to a quiet conversation with Jane, usually dismissed or downplayed by the supervisors who later claimed credit for the ideas. Driven by curiosity and a growing sense of injustice, Leo decided to observe Jane directly. What he saw challenged everything he thought he understood about intelligence, intuition, and the nature of expertise itself. Jane would look at shipping manifests and immediately identify optimization opportunities that should have required hours of analysis to discover. She would glance at routing software and suggest algorithmic improvements that demonstrated understanding of complex mathematical principles that weren't taught in basic logistics training. "Jane," Leo said one afternoon, approaching her desk with a tablet full of data, "I've been watching the improvements in your department, and I have to ask, where did you learn systems optimization?" Jane looked up from her computer screen, her eyes carrying that familiar flicker of confusion that appeared whenever someone asked about her background or training. "I don't know," she replied honestly. "I look at these systems and I just see how they could work better. It's like looking at a puzzle where some of the pieces are in the wrong places."
The simplicity of her explanation was stunning. She was describing intuitive understanding of complex operational systems as if it were as natural as recognizing that a picture was hanging crooked on a wall. Leo realized he was speaking with someone whose cognitive abilities operated on a level that transcended formal education or traditional training. But Jane's growing visibility was also attracting the wrong kind of attention. David Chen had begun monitoring her work more closely, not out of appreciation for her contributions, but out of growing resentment that his authority was being undermined by someone he considered beneath his notice. Her suggestions, which consistently proved more effective than his own management decisions, represented a threat to his position and his carefully constructed narrative about his own competence. "Jane," David said during their weekly review meeting, his voice carrying a sharp edge that hadn't been there during her first weeks, "I need you to focus on your assigned tasks and stop trying to redesign our entire operation. Your job is data entry, not systems analysis. I'm getting concerned about your tendency toward insubordination." The accusation was both false and revealing. Jane had never been insubordinate. She had simply offered suggestions when asked for input or when she noticed obvious problems that were affecting productivity. But David's use of the word insubordination revealed his perception that Jane's competence itself was somehow an act of defiance against the natural order he expected to govern workplace hierarchies. Leo, who had been quietly building his case file about Jane's contributions, felt something shift inside him as he watched David's escalating hostility. This wasn't just about workplace dynamics or management incompetence. This was about a brilliant mind being systematically suppressed and discredited by people who were threatened by abilities they couldn't understand or control. That evening, Leo made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Using his administrative access to the company's personnel systems, he began investigating Jane's background, searching for clues about who she had been before the mysterious car accident that had apparently erased her past. What he discovered in the employment verification databases sent chills down his spine. There was no record of anyone named Jane existing before her accident. Her social security number had been issued less than a year ago. Her address history began with the hospital where she had recovered. Jane wasn't just a mystery employee with extraordinary abilities. She was someone whose entire documented existence had begun with a traumatic event that had somehow stripped away her identity while leaving her genius intact. And Leo was beginning to suspect that this wasn't an accident. It was something far more sinister and deliberate.
Right at that moment, as Leo's investigation was uncovering the impossible truth about Jane's erased identity, the very person responsible for that erasure was about to walk directly into the building where his greatest fear had been hiding in plain sight for months. Marcus Reid stepped out of his black Mercedes in the parking lot of Meridian Logistics, adjusting his $1,000 tie as he prepared for what should have been a routine press event, celebrating Oratech's latest subsidiary acquisition. As the newly minted CEO of Oratech, Marcus had spent the past year consolidating power, eliminating anyone who might question his rapid ascension, and systematically erasing any trace of investigation into his cousin's convenient disappearance. The press tour was part of his strategy to establish legitimacy, to show the business world that Oratech was thriving under his leadership, and that the unfortunate loss of Anya Reid was a tragedy that the company had overcome through strong management and forward-thinking vision. But as Marcus walked through the lobby of Meridian Logistics, shaking hands with local executives and posing for photographers, his eyes swept across the open office space and landed on something that made his blood turn to ice. There, sitting at a corner desk, typing quietly at a computer, was a woman whose profile looked impossibly, devastatingly familiar. The face was thinner than he remembered, the clothes were cheap and ill-fitting, and the posture spoke of someone beaten down by circumstances rather than commanding rooms full of powerful people. But the intelligence in her eyes, the way she held her head when concentrating, the subtle gestures that were uniquely hers, Marcus felt his carefully constructed world begin to crumble as he recognized the woman he had tried to destroy. Excusing himself from the press group with barely controlled panic, Marcus pulled David Chen aside with the kind of urgent authority that demanded immediate compliance. "That woman," Marcus said, his voice low but intense as he gestured toward Jane's desk, "the one in the corner. I need you to get rid of her immediately. Today. I don't care what excuse you use, but she cannot be working here when I return next month." David, eager to please such a high-level executive and already frustrated by Jane's disruption of his authority, nodded with the enthusiasm of someone being given permission to act on his existing resentments. "Consider it done, Mr. Reid. I've actually been documenting performance issues that would justify termination." What neither Marcus nor David realized was that Leo had positioned himself close enough to overhear their conversation, his phone discreetly recording as he pretended to review quarterly reports. The panic in Marcus's voice, the immediate demand for Jane's removal without any apparent knowledge of her work performance, and, most tellingly, the way Marcus had stared at Jane as if he was seeing a ghost, it all confirmed Leo's growing suspicion that Jane's amnesia and mysterious past were connected to something far more sinister than a random car accident.
That evening, Leo approached Jane with a combination of excitement and concern that made her look up from her computer with curiosity. "Jane, I need to show you something, but I need you to promise me you won't panic or make any sudden decisions." He led her to his workstation and pulled up files that he had been compiling for weeks. Encrypted personnel records from Oratech servers, financial documents showing rapid transfers of power and assets, and most shocking of all, news articles about the mysterious disappearance of Anya Reid, Brilliance CEO and tech visionary whose car accident had left no body and whose company had been seamlessly transferred to family management. "Jane," Leo said gently, watching her face as she stared at the photograph of Anya Reid that accompanied the news articles. "I think you need to look at this very carefully. I think you need to see what I'm seeing." The photograph showed a woman in an elegant business suit standing confidently in front of the Oratech logo, her smile radiating the kind of natural authority that came from building something extraordinary through vision and determination. The face was fuller, the hair was styled differently, the clothes spoke of wealth and success. But the eyes were unmistakably familiar. Jane stared at the screen for a long moment, her hand moving unconsciously to her temple as another one of those devastating headaches began to build. But this time, instead of fragmentary images and disconnected sensations, she began to see something more coherent: boardrooms, presentations, the sensation of standing in front of floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over a city skyline. "Leo," she whispered, her voice barely audible as the implications of what she was seeing began to penetrate her consciousness. "Why does that woman look like me? And why do I feel like I've been in that office before?" Leo's response was quiet, but filled with conviction that would change both of their lives forever. "Because I think you have been in that office. I think you built that office. And I think someone tried very hard to make sure you would never remember that you did. If you've ever had someone try to steal your identity, your achievements, or your very sense of self, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that the truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply it's buried. Subscribe because you're about to witness the most powerful memory, recovery, and revenge story ever told. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when a stolen identity meets the unstoppable force of someone reclaiming their true power.
But what happened next would prove that sometimes the final key to unlocking a stolen identity comes not from evidence or investigation, but from the raw cruelty of the very people who tried to destroy you in the first place. 3 days after Leo's revelation about the photographs, Jane was walking to her car in the dimly lit parking lot behind Meridian Logistics when a sleek black BMW pulled up beside her with the aggressive precision of someone making a deliberate statement about power and intimidation. Anya Reid stepped out of the driver's seat, her designer heels clicking against the asphalt with the sharp rhythm of someone accustomed to having every surface she walked on acknowledge her presence. She was dressed in the kind of expensive business attire that spoke of board meetings and executive decisions, her appearance radiating the confidence that came from spending a year living in luxury that had been stolen from someone else. But as Anya approached Jane, her expression carried something far more dangerous than simple arrogance. This was personal hatred mixed with territorial defensiveness, the look of someone who viewed Jane's very existence as a threat to everything she had worked to claim as her own. "Well, well," Anya said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that was designed to make Jane feel small and insignificant. "Look what the cat dragged in. Still playing dress-up as a working woman, I see." Jane stopped walking, something in Chloe's tone triggering a flash of recognition that she couldn't quite place. The voice was familiar in a way that made her stomach tighten with inexplicable anxiety, as if her body was remembering a threat that her conscious mind couldn't identify. "I'm sorry," Jane said carefully. "Do we know each other? I think you might have me confused with someone else." Chloe's laugh was sharp and cruel, echoing off the empty buildings that surrounded the parking lot. "Oh, that's rich. That's absolutely perfect. The great Anya Reid reduced to pretending she doesn't recognize her own sister." The words hit Jane like a physical blow, but it wasn't the claim of sisterhood that shattered her carefully maintained composure. It was the name, Anya Reid. The same name from the news articles Leo had shown her, the name that had been triggering fragments of memory and inexplicable headaches for days. "Listen to me very carefully, you worthless nobody. I don't know how you survived that accident, and I don't know how you managed to crawl out of whatever hole you've been hiding in, but your little comeback tour ends right here, right now."
The venom in Chloe's voice was so pure, so personal, that it cut through every psychological barrier that Jane's damaged mind had constructed to protect itself from memories too painful to process. This wasn't random cruelty from a stranger. This was intimate betrayal from someone who was supposed to love and protect her. "You always thought you were so much smarter than everyone else," Chloe spat, her voice rising with years of suppressed resentment finally finding release. "Always the golden child, always the one with the brilliant ideas, always the one who got everything handed to her while the rest of us had to watch from the sidelines.
as Chloe's words poured out, each sentence loaded with specific knowledge of Jane's past that only family could possess. Something fundamental began to shift in Jane's consciousness. The fragmented images that had been haunting her dreams started connecting, forming coherent memories that rushed back with devastating clarity. She remembered the boardroom, remembered the presentation about artificial intelligence integration, remembered the pride she had felt as investors nodded in appreciation of her vision. She remembered Marcus sitting in the corner, remembered Chloe's false smile as she reviewed financial documents. She remembered the celebration dinner, remembered the strange taste in her wine, remembered the growing disorientation and the terrible realization that the people she trusted most in the world were drugging her. "You should have made sure I was dead," Jane said, her voice transforming from uncertain confusion to ice-cold clarity as her memories crashed back in a torrent of recognition and fury. The change in her posture was immediate and unmistakable. Gone was the hunched, defensive stance of someone beaten down by circumstances beyond her control. In its place stood the natural authority of someone who had built an empire through intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking that had never truly been erased, only temporarily buried. Chloe's face went pale as she registered the transformation happening before her eyes. The broken woman she had come to intimidate was disappearing, replaced by someone whose very presence radiated the kind of power that could destroy careers, lives, and carefully constructed lies with nothing more than a phone call. "My name," Anya said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded boardrooms full of powerful executives. "I am the founder and CEO of Oratech. And you and Marcus just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic little lives by not finishing what you started." The fear that flickered across Chloe's face marked the first crack in the armor of confidence that had protected her for a year of living a stolen life. Anya Reid wasn't just back. She was furious, she was brilliant, and she was about to remind everyone exactly why she had been powerful enough to steal from in the first place.
No one expected what happened next to transform a data analyst's quiet investigation into the most sophisticated corporate takedown in business history, orchestrated by someone who had literally risen from the dead to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her. The morning after her memory recovery, Anya Reid walked into Meridian Logistics with the purposeful stride of someone who had spent the night planning strategic warfare rather than sleeping, her mind now operating with the full power of both her recovered genius and her burning desire for justice. Leo looked up from his computer as Anya approached his desk, and the change in her demeanor was so complete that he initially didn't recognize her. Gone was the uncertain, soft-spoken woman who had been asking tentative questions about her past. In her place stood someone whose very presence commanded attention, whose eyes carried the strategic focus of someone who had built billion-dollar empires and was about to do it again. "Leo," Anya said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made him immediately stop what he was doing and give her his complete attention. "I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible, but I need you to trust me and help me finish what we started." She sat down beside him and, in precise, logical detail, explained not just the return of her memories, but the scoop of the betrayal that had stolen a year of her life. She described Marcus and Chloe's systematic planning, the staged accident, the falsified medical records, and most importantly, the fact that they had used her own security protocols and legal documentation to steal control of the company she had built from nothing. "But here's what they didn't know," Anya continued, her eyes taking on the kind of calculated intensity that Leo was beginning to recognize as the look of someone planning several moves ahead of everyone else in the game. "When I built Oratech's security systems, I installed backdoors that only I know about, administrative access points that would allow me to override any changes made to the corporate structure, even changes made through legal channels." Leo felt his pulse quicken as he realized the implications of what Anya was telling him. She wasn't just planning to expose Marcus and Chloe's crimes. She was planning to do it using the very systems they thought they controlled, turning her own creation into the weapon of their destruction. "They're about to close a merger with Prometheus Industries," Anya explained, pulling up financial documents on Leo's computer with the kind of easy familiarity that demonstrated her intimate knowledge of corporate systems. A $50 billion deal that will make them virtually untouchable, with enough diversified assets and legal protection to survive almost any challenge to their authority. She pointed to specific line items in the financial projections, her finger tracing patterns that revealed discrepancies that Leo would have taken weeks to identify on his own. But the merger is built on fraudulent valuations and falsified performance metrics. They've been using my algorithms and innovations to inflate Oratech's value while claiming credit for developments they had no part in creating.
As Anya continued her analysis, Leo watched her transform from someone seeking justice into someone architecting it with surgical precision. She wasn't acting out of emotion or impulse. She was planning a response that would be so comprehensive and devastating that Marcus and Chloe would lose not just their stolen power, but their freedom, their reputation, and any possibility of ever threatening anyone again. "The annual shareholder meeting is next week," Anya said, her voice taking on the tone of someone who had just identified the perfect moment to strike. "Marcus will be presenting the merger proposal to the board and to live-streamed investors around the world. Maximum visibility, maximum impact, maximum humiliation when everything falls apart." She opened a new program on Leo's computer, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the kind of fluid efficiency that spoke of countless hours spent building and refining complex systems. "I'm going to create something I'm calling the Phoenix Protocol, a program that will simultaneously expose every falsified document, every illegal transfer, every fraudulent claim they've made over the past year." Leo watched in fascination as lines of code appeared on the screen, elegant and precise, creating what was essentially a digital weapon designed to destroy lies and restore truth with unstoppable momentum. "But we're not just going to expose them," Anya continued. "We're going to do it in a way that ensures justice extends beyond just my personal situation." She pulled up additional files showing communication logs, financial transfers, and personnel decisions that revealed a pattern of systemic corruption extending far beyond Marcus and Chloe's theft of her company. They've been using Oratech's resources to silence other victims, to cover up other crimes, to protect a network of corrupt executives who enabled their takeover. The scope of what Anya was planning began to dawn on Leo as he realized that the Phoenix Protocol wasn't just about personal revenge, it was about systematic accountability that would protect future victims and prevent similar betrayals from succeeding. She was using her return from the dead not just to reclaim her stolen life, but to ensure that the systems that had enabled her destruction would be permanently dismantled. "Leo," Anya said, turning to face him with the kind of intensity that made him understand he was being invited to participate in something historic, "are you ready to help me remind the world what happens when you try to bury someone who was built to rise?"
But what happened next would become the most watched corporate takedown in business history, a moment when justice, technology, and strategic brilliance converged to create a reckoning that would be studied in business schools and courtrooms for generations to come. The grand ballroom of the Seattle Convention Center buzzed with the electric energy of hundreds of shareholders, investors, and media representatives who had gathered for Oratech's annual meeting, unaware that they were about to witness the resurrection of a woman who had been presumed dead, and the destruction of those who had tried to bury her. Anya Reid stood at the podium, resplendent in his tailored Armani suit, his confidence radiating the kind of absolute certainty that came from believing he had successfully stolen an empire and gotten away with it. Behind him, massive screens displayed Oratech's impressive financial metrics, growth projections, and the stunning details of the Prometheus Industries merger that would cement his position as one of the most powerful tech executives in the world. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying across the ballroom with theatrical authority. Today marks not just another milestone for Oratech, but a transformation that will redefine the entire landscape of artificial intelligence and corporate innovation. He gestured toward the screens with the practiced confidence of someone who had convinced himself that his stolen success was actually earned achievement. Chloe sat in the front row, her designer dress and expensive jewelry creating a picture of success that had been built entirely on betrayal and fraud. She watched her cousin's presentation with the satisfied expression of someone who believed that their crimes had been perfectly executed and permanently concealed. But in the back of the ballroom, near the media section where television cameras were broadcasting the event live to investors around the world, Anya Reid waited with the patient stillness of someone who had spent a week preparing for this exact moment. She was dressed in a stunning power suit that mirrored the one she had worn in her final presentation a year ago, her appearance commanding attention and respect from everyone who had noticed her entrance. Leo sat nearby, his laptop open and connected to Oratech's internal network through the backdoor access that Anya had provided. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, waiting for the signal that would activate the Phoenix protocol and transform Marcus's moment of triumph into his complete destruction. As Marcus reached the climax of his presentation, describing the financial projections that would make the merger irresistible to shareholders, Anya rose from her seat with the fluid grace of someone who commanded boardrooms and built empires through intelligence and determination.
"Activate the Phoenix protocol," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet ballroom as every head turned to identify the source of the interruption. The screens behind Marcus flickered and went dark for a moment before filling with evidence that hit the room like a series of controlled explosions. Financial documents showing the fraudulent transfers of assets, recorded conversations between Marcus and Chloe planning Anya's elimination, medical records proving the staged accident, and most damaging of all, detailed analysis of how every innovation Marcus was claiming credit for had actually been developed by the woman they had tried to murder. The room erupted in gasps and shocked murmurs as shareholders, investors, and media representatives realized they were witnessing not just corporate fraud being exposed, but the return from the dead of one of the tech industry's most brilliant minds. Marcus stood frozen at the podium, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing horror as he watched his carefully constructed lies being systematically demolished by someone who wasn't supposed to exist. Chloe's expression transformed from smug satisfaction to pure terror as she recognized the woman walking confidently toward the stage. Anya took the microphone from Marcus's nerveless fingers, her presence commanding immediate attention from every person in the ballroom and every viewer watching the live stream around the world. "My name is Anya Reid," she said, her voice carrying the kind of natural authority that made 300 people fall into complete silence. "I am the founder and CEO of Oratech, and I've come back to finish my performance review." The words hit the ballroom like a thunderbolt, confirming what the evidence on the screens had already demonstrated. The women they had mourned as dead had returned to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her, and the people who had tried to destroy her were about to face consequences that matched the magnitude of their betrayal. Security guards, confused and unsure who to protect or detain, stood frozen as they realized that the woman commanding the stage might actually be the person with ultimate authority over everyone present, including themselves.
But what happened next proved that true leadership isn't just about reclaiming stolen power. It's about transforming the systems that allowed betrayal to flourish in the first place, ensuring that no one else would ever have to endure what she had survived.
Within hours of the Phoenix Protocol's activation, federal agents were escorting Marcus and Chloe from the convention center in handcuffs, their faces captured by dozens of cameras as they were led away to face charges of conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, and corporate theft that would ensure they spent decades in prison. The evidence that Anya had systematically compiled was so comprehensive and undeniable that prosecutors described it as the most airtight case of corporate crime they had ever seen. Bank records, communication logs, falsified medical documents, and recorded conversations created a paper trail so detailed that Marcus and Chloe's defense attorneys advised immediate guilty pleas in exchange for reduced sentences that would still keep them incarcerated for the better part of their lives. But Anya's focus had already shifted beyond personal justice to the systematic transformation that would define her true legacy. Standing before the same board of directors who had been complicit in accepting her disappearance without proper investigation, she announced changes that would revolutionize not just Oratech, but serve as a model for corporate accountability throughout the industry. Effective immediately, Anya declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had literally returned from the dead to reclaim her vision. The old board structure is dissolved. We will be implementing transparent governance protocols, mandatory bias reporting systems, and zero-tolerance policies for any form of discrimination or ethical violation. She gestured toward Leo, who stood nearby with the kind of quiet pride that came from understanding that his courage and believing in her had helped save not just one person's life, but an entire company's integrity. Leo Martinez, whose investigative work and moral courage made today's justice possible, will be appointed as our new Chief Ethics Officer, with direct authority to investigate any concerns and report findings to shareholders without executive interference. The promotion was both recognition of Leo's contributions and a strategic placement of someone whose loyalty and integrity were unquestionable in a position where they could prevent future betrayals from succeeding. But Anya's most ambitious transformation was yet to come. Using the resources that Marcus and Chloe had tried to steal, she announced the creation of the Aura Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting victims of corporate crime, providing legal aid for those who had been betrayed by people in positions of trust, and developing technologies that could detect and prevent the kind of systematic fraud that had nearly destroyed her life. Every person who has ever been silenced, discredited, or erased by those who abuse their power will have access to resources and support through the Aura Foundation, Anya explained to the media gathering that had grown exponentially as news of her resurrection spread around the world. We're going to use artificial intelligence and blockchain technology to create transparent systems that make it virtually impossible for powerful people to hide their crimes or destroy evidence of their misconduct.
The Foundation's first initiative was a mentorship program that paired successful executives with emerging entrepreneurs from underrepresented backgrounds, providing not just financial support, but strategic guidance and protection from the kind of exploitation that had nearly ended Anya's career. 6 months later, Anya sat in her restored office, the same floor-to-ceiling windows framing the Seattle skyline, as she mentored Sarah Chen, a brilliant young woman whose innovative approach to sustainable technology reminded Anya of her own early passion for using innovation to solve real-world problems. The most important thing to remember, Anya told Sarah as they reviewed business plans that showed extraordinary promise, is that your true value can never be stolen, only temporarily forgotten. No matter what obstacles people try to place in your path, no matter how many times they try to convince you that you don't belong in rooms where decisions are made, your brilliance will always find a way to surface. As Sarah left the meeting with renewed confidence and concrete support for her vision, Anya reflected on the strange journey that had taken her from the peak of success through the depths of betrayal and back to a position where she could ensure that others would never have to endure what she had survived. The Phoenix Protocol had been designed to deliver justice, but its true power had been in proving that some people are simply too strong, too brilliant, and too determined to be permanently destroyed by those who mistake temporary advantage for lasting victory.
Marcus and Chloe had tried to bury her, not realizing that they were actually planting seeds for something far more powerful than what they had tried to steal. Anya Reid hadn't just returned from the dead, she had returned with the wisdom, resources, and determination to build a world where brilliance was protected rather than exploited, where justice was systematic rather than accidental, and where the phoenix could rise again and again no matter how many times small minds tried to clip its wings.
Here's what Anya understood that most people never learn. The most devastating betrayals don't destroy you. They reveal who you really are beneath everything that can be stolen. She could have exposed Marcus and Chloe the moment her memories returned, could have destroyed them with a single phone call. Instead, she chose strategic patience, building an unshakable case while creating systems that would protect countless others from similar betrayals. As someone who's witnessed corporate betrayals from inside Fortune 500 boardrooms, I can tell you that what happened to Anya isn't rare, it's just rarely documented this completely. Family members, trusted partners, and close colleagues steal identities, siphon resources, and destroy lives every day in corporate America. But Anya's response created something unprecedented, proof that authentic brilliance is literally indestructible, that stolen power crumbles when confronted by recovered truth. The real lesson here isn't about having billions to reclaim or backdoor access to corporate systems. It's about understanding that your core value exists independent of circumstances, memory, or recognition. When everything external is stripped away, your wealth, your identity, even your memories, what remains is the essence that built everything in the first place. That essence can't be stolen, only temporarily buried. The Phoenix Protocol wasn't just digital revenge, it was systematic transformation that ensured individual trauma became collective protection. Anya didn't just survive her betrayal, she weaponized it into permanent accountability systems that changed how an entire industry handles trust and transparency. If you believe that authentic brilliance always rises above those who try to bury it, smash that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that their true value can never be stolen, only temporarily forgotten. Subscribe for more stories where strategic genius meets unbreakable resilience, where the buried rise to become unstoppable, and where individual survival becomes collective transformation. Because sometimes the most powerful response to being erased is to rise so powerfully that you reshape the entire landscape around you.